Hey everybody, it's Derek here. Thanks as always for stopping by. So recently I had done a live stream where I reviewed, I think, 4 or 5 books. And this one happened to come up in that list. And there were some things that came up in this book that really warrants its own book review video. So that's what this is. Let me tell you about it. I had read this book here. It's called The 100 Years' War on Palestine. It was written by Rashid Khalidi, subtitled A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. So it covers from 1917 to 2017. I had read this book, I think it was shortly after the renewed hostilities there in the Levant on October 7th. It was such a good book because I even though I've read a lot about this conflict, because things didn't start on October 7th, as much as Israel would love you to believe. There's a long history before that, and many people aren't familiar with it. They just think that it's a bunch of racist Arabs, trying to murder and renew a Holocaust on the Jews. And it's a complete misrepresentation of what's actually going on over there. Most people don't know the living conditions of Palestinians. And anyway, I'm getting carried on into the content. I had picked this book up because actually my good friend had recommended it to me, my friend Ian. And he's a very well-read kind of scholarly guy, and he was recommending it. So I bought it, and I'm so glad that I did. Rashid Khalidi is a very, very respected person in the Palestinian resistance, kind of a power family, if you will, dating back to, I think he was a grandnephew of a mayor. This guy right here, Yusuf Daya al-Din Pasha al-Khalidi. So that's kind of a mouthful, isn't it? And there's been many people since, we'll just call him Khalidi Sr., because this is like the end of the 19th century, just about. 1896 stands out in my mind, although I could be wrong. There's been many other Khalidis that have come, I think about 6 or 7, including Rashid, and they've been really instrumental in the fight for Palestinian rights and sovereignty and that sort of thing. And so this guy is really respected. My socks were blown off the whole way through this book. His historicity, his scholarship, his integrity. He's such a passionate writer on this topic. And of course, he's had many other books. But, and it's gotten all kinds of press. I believe Norman Finkelstein, who I'm another really big fan of, has cited this quite a lot. I'm just trying to see him in the press here. Chris Hedges, so he's quite respected. Anyway, going right into the substance of the book, he starting basically with the Balfour Declaration, which came online just after the Sykes-Picot partition of the Ottoman Empire amongst the French and the British. So Palestine fell on the British side of that line. And, he explains that there were, of course, territorial and linguistic and identitarian and religio fissures that were already extant and needed to be respected. And that was written into the Balfour Declaration. For example, he's got an image of the Balfour Declaration right here, and an excerpt from it says, Palestine is inhabited by others who will not easily accept their own displacement. So it doesn't say so much in the Balfour Declaration, doesn't expand on this, but everything that we would connect with statehood, having a currency, having a common language, having a distinct unique religious character, although they never defined it the way Israel is defining modern Israel as, Jewish homeland, which is going a step too far, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people I've read. Everything that we define and connect and relate to statehood, Palestine was it. And I mean, the history is so extensive, even the literature of Shakespeare cites Palestine. as a unique entity. And what I find so amazing about this this topic, let's just look at Ukraine. He's not so much talking about this Ukraine side, because this was written a few years ago. Obviously, this was written back in 2022, I believe. No, I'm sorry. It was written 4 years ago in 2020. So, obviously this is just still a couple of years prior to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. You look at the territorial, linguistic, religio makeup of the Ukraine, and, it's far more fluid and recent. In fact, the linguistic element of it is, still kind of coming online as an official language. So, if you're going to make the case for Ukraine, a sovereign Ukraine, which of course that was unquestioning just about, that was the international consensus when Russia invaded Ukraine. It was like, this is so brutal and imperialist, and where are these aspirations to empire that Russia is making in the fall of the Soviet Union, and this delusive kind of affiliation and aspiration that Putin had, of Ukraine being somehow connected and still relevant and important to Russia. That all collapses, and the world condemned him and fulminated against him, and rightly so. And yet, if you're going to look at the Ukraine incident, those lines of affiliation to the land, the language, the even the lines, which were very blurred, they weren't defined well. You have a much harder case making an argument for sovereignty, and yet the world still clung to it, and they rightly should. But why aren't we doing that in the case of Palestine, where there was a currency, there was property titles, and there was a tax system, there was everything that we would associate a statehood, and yet we deny it in the case of Palestine? It just makes no bloody sense. He talks about that coming out of Sykes-Picot and leading into the Balfour Declaration, and how the British had an obligation, and even had pretty explicit mention of the indigenous reality on the ground in Palestine, that this was not just to be cast to the wind with the rest of the Ottoman Empire, that this was going to retain sovereignty and some national identity and all the rest of it. So these claims from people like Ben Shapiro and lots of other Israel's apologists, that there was no Palestine, and later on it became absorbed into the neighboring satellite Arab states, specifically Egypt and Transjordan, that collapses, because we're still talking about a population that has roughly been, especially in modern times, at least on parity, and in the early years represented the majority of the population of Palestine. It just collapses, that whole mentality, and Britain definitely made a lot of assurances, and this indigenous population is to be respected, religions are to be respected, so that goes until about 1939, and then you got the Second World War, where now you've got a Holocaust, the migration crisis that was created there, because the Western states, they rejected a vast majority. We're talking maybe a handful of Jews were welcome into Canada and the United States, but the vast majority of them were turned away. In fact, if you want a really good accounting of this, specifically from the Canadian perspective, I would recommend a book called None is Too Many by Abella and Troper. I can't remember their first names, but it's become a classic in Holocaust literature, and it really demonstrates what was the position of most Western lands, specifically Canada, who was otherwise. I mean, what have we associated with Canada? We're the peacemakers. We're the ones who accept refugees. Historically, we've always been the least xenophobic of the Western lands, arguably, of course. But in the case of the Jews, it was different. And so now we had this expectation of Palestine to absorb all these Zionists not just Jews, but you can imagine coming out of the Holocaust, that Zionist sentiment was so strong. In fact, I was just reading a book recently by Yossi Klein Halevi, who says if there was an Israel, there would have been no Holocaust. I dispute that, but it shows you, kind of gives you insight into the psychology of the identity between Jews and Zionism, right? Anyway, he goes through all that, and the migration crisis that was created, and then, there's the second declaration of war, and it focuses on 1947 being the UN partition, and then 1948, where Israel declares statehood, into the third declaration of war in 1967. So, of course, you had some impressive conflicts in the 50s, but it was really the Six-Day War in 1967 where Israel conquered a whole vast swath of land. And they took the Golan Heights from Syria, and some land from Transjordan and Egypt, and the whole Sinai Peninsula. You'll remember that. And so that's where 1967 comes in. And then the fourth declaration of war, which is, speaks, well, it lists 1982, but sort of the background to 1982, the First Intifada. And then he starts talking in the fifth chapter with the fifth declaration of war between 87 and 95. So now you've got, the Intifada, First Intifada, leading into, Palestine being taken very seriously under Arafat, running out of Beirut and, Tunisia, somewhere, I can't remember. What was so impressive about that, though, is that now you've got the first admission and recognition by Israel that there is a Palestinian identity after all. And, they start to take Arafat very seriously. That's 87 to 95. You're obviously leading to the second Oslo. So from the first in, I think it was 1992 or 3, and which was basically just a recognition of the PLO to Israel, saying, adoption of the UN declaration, I think it was 242, saying that Israel exists, and we affirm their existence here, and we're going to try to work out some sort of settlement, which leads into Oslo II, which was a huge disappointment, and it took way too long, and Arafat had very little of tangible significance to bring to his people. And so this was really the decline of all of that goodwill that, we felt, in the early 90s and late 80s. And then now we're talking about Camp David there in the sixth chapter, the sixth declaration of war in the year 2000. It goes from 2000 to 2014. So you're talking about, the collapse of Camp David. Well, you got another second intifada, right? In the early 2000s, leading into 2005 was when Hamas wasn't going to be a main player in Gaza. They didn't want to participate in the elections, but they kind of just said, what the hell, why not? And they won. And they won, according to Jimmy Carter, they won fair and square. According to Ban Ki-moon, it wasn't really a fair election. I don't know where to come out on that. I lately, after reading a lot, I'm kind of leaning towards Norman Finkelstein and Jimmy Carter viewed of that, it was the will of the people, right? And immediately, there wasn't even one attack, one rocket fired or nothing after 2005. And Israel left, they dug up their graves and everything. They got got the hell out of there now the occupation becomes a perimeter occupation around the entire Gaza Strip. And they throw up this blockade where, it's a land blockade, it's an aerial blockade, and naval blockade. So now you've got effectively a concentration camp. That's when they start to impose, rationing and calorie-restricted diets on everybody. And no thing goes into Gaza without Israel's consent. No thing leaves Gaza without Israel's consent. And likewise, no person, no body goes into Gaza without Israel's consent, and no one leaves under the same conditions. So, now you've got this real humanitarian crisis where people needing treatment for terrible diseases and wanting to leave for humanitarian grounds, international trade is cut off, everything. You're in a concentration camp. And now you start to see the modern era take form. Blitzkrieg and oppression, routine violence and ground incursions and all the rest of it against Gaza. And this is to say nothing about the Cantons and Bantustans in the West Bank. That's about where it tapers off. I think he's talking about the 100 Years' War from 1917 to 2017. So just before the March of Return, which was overwhelmingly peaceful, and that was in 2018. That's where Israel opens up fire on journalists and even disabled people 300 feet away from the barrier. There's no argument that you can make that there was a legitimate hostility presented by Palestinians in that case. So anybody who wants to say that, Palestinians just won't accept the existence of Israel, it's been entirely the other way about. And so he documents all that really well up to just prior to, the March of Return in 2018. So I would really recommend this book, guys. It's just a wonderful book, extremely well sourced and scholarly, and there is no better voice than Rashid Khalidi. I mean, he's been at the forefront of this fight for such a long time. I'd highly recommend this book. Hey everyone, I hope you liked this video. If you want more like the one you just watched, click the suggested video on this screen. Make sure you subscribe, and to connect with me on my other platforms, my handles are linked below in the description, alright? Take care, peeps. Till next time.